The day my marriage ended was supposed to be like any other. I woke up early, brewed coffee, and prepared for work. Nick, my husband of 5 years and partner of over a decade, seemed unusually distant that morning. I asked if everything was okay, and he gave me a distracted nod, scrolling through his phone as if I wasn't there. It wasn't unusual for us to feel disconnected. We'd been arguing more frequently over the last year, but something about his demeanor unsettled me. It wasn't until later that evening, as I sat on the couch and he left his phone unattended, that my suspicions reached a boiling point. For months, I'd felt the undercurrent of something wrong. Late-night texts, secretive calls, and a sudden reluctance to spend time together all pointed to something I was too afraid to admit. My heart pounded as I unlocked his phone, dreading what I might find. What I found shattered me. The messages between Nick and his receptionist left no room for doubt. Their conversation was explicit and emotional, filled with confessions of love and plans for their future. They mocked me, Nick's workaholic wife who didn't know how to have fun. My hands trembled as I scrolled further, piecing together months of betrayal. The man I had trusted with my life had been living a lie, and I was the last to know that. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I grabbed a small bag and packed a few essentials. My hands moved mechanically, my mind reeling. When Nick asked where I was going, I told him I needed space and walked out without waiting for his response. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't stay under the same roof as the man who had betrayed me so deeply. As I drove aimlessly, my parents' house seemed like the only refuge. Despite our strained relationship, they were my parents. I imagined my mother wrapping me in a comforting hug and my father offering his quiet support. I needed their guidance, their love, their assurance that I wasn't alone. But when I arrived and knocked on their door, their reaction was far from what I expected. My father opened the door, his expression unreadable. "Dad," I started, my voice breaking. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you and Mom." He didn't move to let me inside. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder and then back at me. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious. "Nick cheated on me," I blurted out, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "I left him. I need a place to stay for a few days." To my shock, he didn't respond with concern or anger on my behalf. Instead, he frowned and said, "I don't think that's a good idea. You're married. You should go home and work things out with your husband." I blinked, thinking I must have misheard him. "Dad, did you hear what I said? Nick cheated on me. I can't go back to him." By then, my mother had joined him at the door. Her face was tight with disapproval. "We've already spoken to Nick," she said. "He told us everything. He's sorry, and he wants to fix things. You shouldn't have left like that." I was speechless. "You're taking his side? After what he did?" "Marriage isn't easy," my father said. "Both of you made mistakes. One person can't ruin a marriage. You need to figure this out together." Their words felt like a slap in the face. I had always known my parents were traditional, valuing appearances and stability above all else, but I never imagined they would turn their backs on me in my darkest hour. I pleaded with them to let me stay, even for just a night, but they refused. They stood firm, insisting that I was overreacting and that leaving Nick was a mistake. It was a surreal moment, standing on their doorstep, tears streaming down my face, begging for help while they dismissed my pain. Eventually, I gave up. I turned and walked back to my car, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. My friend Lydia was the one who saved me. I called her from my car, barely able to speak through my sobs. She told me to come over immediately and didn't ask for details until I was ready to share. Lydia's tiny apartment became my sanctuary over the next 2 weeks. She gave me the space to grieve, vent, and plan my next steps. During those weeks, I contacted a lawyer and started the process of filing for divorce. It was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but staying in a marriage with a man who didn't respect or value me wasn't an option. Lydia encouraged me every step of the way, reminding me of my strength when I doubted myself. My parents, on the other hand, were relentless in their disapproval. They called me multiple times, urging me to reconcile with Nick. They accused me of being selfish, too focused on my career to make my marriage work. Their words hurt, but they also steeled my resolve. If they couldn't support me in this, I didn't need them in my life. By the time the divorce was finalized, I had moved into a new apartment and begun to rebuild. My friends became my chosen family, surrounding me with love and understanding. It was a slow process, but I began to find myself again. I wasn't looking for love when I met Charlie 3 years later. A group of friends had dragged me out to dinner at a new restaurant, determined to lift my spirits. Charlie, the owner and chef, introduced himself to our table, and we struck up a conversation. His easy smile and genuine warmth put me at ease in a way I hadn't felt in years. Over the next few months, Charlie and I went on casual dates that gradually turned into something more serious. I learned that he had built his restaurant from the ground up, inspired by his father, who owned a successful bakery chain. Despite his success, Charlie was humble and down-to-earth. He didn't see my ambition as a threat, he admired it. For the first time, I felt truly seen and valued in a relationship. When Charlie proposed, I felt like I was finally stepping into a new chapter of my life. We shared the news with our friends and his family, who were overjoyed. But when we announced our engagement on social media, it triggered a response I wasn't prepared for. 3 days after the announcement, I received an email from my parents. It was the first time I'd heard from them in years. They congratulated me on my engagement and apologized for their past behavior. They claimed they wanted to mend our relationship and attend the wedding. At first, I was hesitant to believe them, but their message seemed sincere. That is, until their second email arrived. The second email from my parents stripped away any illusion of sincerity. It wasn't about reconnecting with me, it was about Charlie and, more specifically, his family's wealth. They gushed about his impressive background, and how proud they were of me for finding a prestigious match. The focus wasn't on my happiness or our relationship, it was on the social and financial clout they believed Charlie brought into my life. The email left me fuming. After years of silence, their sudden interest wasn't rooted in regret or love, it was transactional. They saw an opportunity to align themselves with Charlie's success, and they were eager to exploit it. I didn't respond to either email. I wanted no part of their newfound admiration, especially when it had nothing to do with me as a person. But my parents weren't ready to give up. One evening, about a week after their emails, my parents showed up unannounced at Charlie's apartment, where I'd been living for the past year. Seeing them on the doorstep stirred a mix of anger and unease. They had never visited me before, not even when I was struggling to start over. Now, they stood outside, smiling as if nothing had happened. Charlie answered the door before I could, his calm demeanor masking his distaste. He greeted them politely but didn't invite them inside. "You're here to see her," he said, his tone measured. "I'll get her." I joined him at the door, and he stood beside me, silently offering his support. My parents immediately launched into their apologies, saying they had acted poorly during my divorce and wanted to make amends. They claimed they had reflected on their mistakes and realized how much they had hurt me. At first, their words sounded convincing, but as the conversation unfolded, their true motives became clear. They began asking questions about Charlie, his family, his career, his plans for the future. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. They weren't here to mend our relationship, they were here to ingratiate themselves with the man they saw as my ticket to a better life. "I don't think this is the right time for this conversation," I said firmly. "You've made your feelings about me very clear in the past. I'm not ready to forgive you." My father's expression darkened. "You're being unreasonable," he said. We're trying to make things right, and you're throwing it back in our faces. Is this because you think you're better than us now? Because of Charlie? The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it was so far from the reality of who I was. I opened my mouth to respond, but Charlie stepped in first. This has nothing to do with me, he said calmly. It has everything to do with how you treated her. You had 5 years to apologize, and you chose now, after her engagement, to suddenly care? That doesn't sound like love to me. His words silenced them. My father glared at him but said nothing. My mother looked at me with pleading eyes, but I shook my head. You need to leave, I said. And don't come back. As I shut the door, I felt a wave of relief. For the first time, I had stood up to my parents without letting their words tear me down. Charlie put his arm around me, and I knew I wasn't alone in this fight. The fallout from that confrontation was swift. A few days later, my paternal grandparents called me. They rarely involved themselves in family conflicts, but this time, they were adamant about weighing in. They scolded me for shutting my parents out, accusing me of being ungrateful and disrespectful. They've always done their best for you, my grandmother said. Yes, they made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you can treat them like this. I was stunned. For years, my grandparents had stayed neutral, claiming they didn't want to take sides. Now, they were fully aligned with my parents, demanding I apologize for my behavior. I'm sorry, but I disagree, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Where were they when I needed them the most? When I was standing on their doorstep, begging for help? They chose Nick over me. They don't get to come back now just because they think Charlie's family is impressive. My grandmother sighed. This isn't about Charlie. It's about family. You need to forgive them. But it was about Charlie, at least for my parents. Their sudden interest had nothing to do with love or reconciliation. It was about appearances, status, and control. I ended the call, knowing I wouldn't get through to them. That evening, Charlie and I talked about the situation at length. He pointed out something I hadn't considered before: my grandparents had only gotten involved now because their neutrality was no longer convenient. When it was just me against my parents, they stayed out of it. But now that their loyalty to my parents was being questioned, they felt compelled to defend them. They don't care about you, Charlie said bluntly. They care about maintaining the illusion of a united family. That's not love. His words were harsh but true. For years, I had tried to rationalize my parents' behavior, telling myself they were flawed but well-meaning. Now, I saw them, and my grandparents, for who they really were. They weren't interested in me as a person. They were interested in what I could offer them. 2 months later, Charlie and I were married in a small, intimate ceremony. His family embraced me with open arms, making me feel like I finally belonged. My parents weren't invited, and neither were my grandparents. The few relatives who attended were on my mother's side, people who had always supported me without judgment. The day was perfect. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. As Charlie and I danced under the soft glow of string lights, I knew I had made the right choices, for my marriage, my future, and myself. 2 days after the wedding, my parents called from a burner phone. I didn't recognize the number, so I picked up. They congratulated me on my marriage and said they were happy for me, even though they hadn't been invited. Their tone was surprisingly gentle, but I wasn't ready to let my guard down. Thank you, I said curtly. I hope you understand why I didn't include you. There was a pause before my mother spoke. We do. And we're sorry for everything. Maybe they meant it, or maybe they didn't. Either way, I wasn't ready to let them back into my life. I hung up, knowing that this chapter was finally closed. For now, neutrality feels like the best solution. My parents and grandparents may never fully understand the pain they caused me, but I've moved on. My life with Charlie is filled with love and support, and I'm determined to protect that at all costs. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to have radish and real stories with you. Have a great day.